This is Father Patrick Briscoe.
And this is Father Bonaventure Chapman.
Welcome to Godsplaining. Thanks to all who support us. If you like the show, please consider making a monthly donation to us on Patreon. Be sure to like and subscribe to Godsplaining wherever you listen to your podcasts. Father Bonaventure.
Father Patrick.
I love that often the first thing we say on the podcast is our names.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, and, it's sort of like an assertion of reality. Like, in front of me
Here I am.
is a man existing.
Yeah.
And I believe he's not just a phantasm or something conjured from my memory, but a real person, and that his name is more than... that his name kind of conjures his presence. And I want to share that presence by naming him to those listening.
Names have that way. Isn't it interesting how names have a magicalness to them? I mean, it's not unsurprising, like secret names and codes, and you can be in a crowd and just, mingling. There's lots of noise going on, right? But then all of a sudden the name appears and you're drawn to it.
That's
right. Bonaventure, I'm obviously going to swing my head around. It's a bit like, this is the wrong way of the analogy, but like the Alexa sort of thing. Where like it's always just kind of listening, but it only kind of wakes up to consciousness when you use its name. It's and in some ways that's kind of a thing we do anyway as well. I remember a movie. It was Mr. Smith Goes to Washington or something. The Jimmy Stewart movie, and he's got the his daughter that a dance or something. If I remember correctly, it's black and white. It's great, and Johnny or whatever. And his daughter is, she's beautiful, but of course
Obviously.
no boy is dancing with her. So you've got to kind of imagine this would be possible. And maybe in the 50s it was. It strikes me as bizarre. And so he has to find like a date for her because she's kind of sad about this. And so he just yells out into the crowd, "Hey, Joe." And of course, the most handsome man pops up because he just thinks like, well, Joe is a common enough name that there'll be someone here who will hear Joe and respond to it. So names have this way of like summoning us from the day-to-day and the ordinary and the kind of, Heidegger would call it like the Vorhanden, just kind of existing with things, to like, boom, brought into presence by this name. So, yeah, I like names.
That can happen, when you're sitting in Mass, for example, and there's some guy, a priest, doing something, preaching, and he's rambling on, and then all of a sudden he says, as J.R.R. Tolkien once wrote.
Yes. You're paying attention.
Suddenly, I leap forth from my slumber. How's that for a transition?
It is a good transition.
That leads us to the subject of today's episode, which is to talk about some of the differences in the writing of J.R.R. Tolkien and his good friend C.S. Lewis. But before we get too far into that, I think we should first pause to pay homage to these two great men.
Yes.
So one of the things, for example, that I loved about Tolkien was that his love for language and tradition was so great that very famously, after the Mass began to be celebrated in the vernacular, Tolkien would shout loudly at the top of his voice the responses in Latin.
Yes. Yeah, to his son recalls this
imagine
sort of
a man of such conviction. I love this.
Yeah.
This is truly admirable.
But he was still there, he didn't leave. He stayed.
Yes, he stayed.
Yeah. So
faithful to the church in Rome.
Exactly.
Take notes.
Just noting his questioning of the dignity of
certainly
the New
his
English.
Preference. Yeah,
His preference. That's right. That's certainly his preference. Yeah. I think, C.S. Lewis strikes me he's a jollier figure in some ways.
Yes.
What struck me interesting about C.S. Lewis, of course, is when I studied over in England, I found out that English people don't. He's okay. He's a important kind of, but he doesn't have the same power that he has in America. And I remember an English person saying, "Yeah, you Americans really love C.S. Lewis, don't you?" And I thought, well, you're the ones who should really love him. He's like the most English man alive, Don and all this kind of stuff. But they don't, they're not, it never struck me as that particular attached. Whereas in the evangelical world, the Protestant world, and even the Catholic world, of course, C.S. Lewis is a household name. And that was not true over there. I also love the story how Walter Hooper, I think, is how it's pronounced, was an American, was a good friend of his, went to visit him for the first time. And when he arrived, he needed to use, of course, the bathroom. And so we asked C.S. Lewis if he could go to the bathroom, where the bathroom was. And C.S. Lewis was delighted in this because his house, lots of British houses have separate toilets, which is the room with the toilet, and the bathroom, which has the bathtub. And so Lewis took him to the bathroom and turned on the taps and got a towel for him and said, "Well, whenever you're finished, just let me know. I'll be waiting for you." And so he forced Hooper to say, "Oh, yeah, actually, I'm looking for the other things. The toilet? Is that okay? You could say it. It's not a bad word here." But it reminded me of the Americans. We don't. It seems uncouth.
Why would you? Yes.
If I'm not going to the bathroom, I might go up to the washroom or something.
Right.
But I'm not going to.
The restroom.
The restroom.
I like the restroom.
Exactly.
Like
take a nap.
place to compose yourself. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Take
But
a
I'm
little
never going to
pause.
say, "Do you know where the toilet is?" Because for us, the toilet is not the room, but that porcelain thing there. And I would never let people know that I would be using a toilet in a bathroom. Right.
So Tolkien and Lewis, they had, I think most of our listeners certainly know this, they had a great friendship. They were part of this reading group that referred to themselves as the Inklings that often met. Well, they were first part of another group, which was dedicated to
Norse
mythology. Yeah.
Yep.
And then out of that shared interest in Nordic mythology came this group, the Inklings, which was a group dedicated to reading and sharing their writings and kind of discussion. And they would meet at a pub,
Bird and the
which
Baby.
they nicknamed the Bird and the Baby, the Eagle and Child.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that group included
Dorothy
Sayers, other great luminaries. So it was a whole collection, a coterie
Charles
of
Williams
people.
in that group too.
Yes,
Okay,
absolutely, yeah. And other students, we'll mention a couple of them as the conversation goes on. And one of the things they would do, right, is they would exchange their writings and they would sort of critique each other and share things around. And very famously, in that circle, when Tolkien was laboring over the Lord of the Rings trilogy and creating his whole mythology of Middle-earth, very famously, Lewis was extremely complimentary towards Tolkien's efforts.
Mm-hmm.
And very famously, when Lewis presented Tolkien with the Chronicles of Narnia, Tolkien was not complimentary.
Yes.
So I think that's really the heart of the episode, and there are a lot of complicated reasons why this is. So I wanted listeners to know this from the outset, that we have a kind of fundamental difference between these two friends. Namely that Lewis responded he was very interested in Tolkien's project. He was very very complimentary, and perhaps Tolkien really needed that and appreciated it, and perhaps also Lewis would have expected the same from Tolkien as Lewis undertook his project.
Yes, but I suppose, is it Aristotle who says at some point when he's saying some bad things about people he calls the friends of the forums, who are Plato and his cohort, and he was a student of Plato, and at some point he says, well, we must say some bad things about friends. But we do, at the end of the day, care more about truth than we do care about our friends, and our friends care about that too. So it's a sense of true. It's that you should obviously wrap this in the right approach.
This is the man shouting the Latin mass responses.
Yeah,
yes.
exactly. And I'm sure. Yeah, Lewis was probably not surprised, taken aback maybe initially, but
he knows his friend.
The projects in some ways are. It's fitting. They're very different. If they had not had a difference about this, maybe not in particularly in acerbic ways, but if they not had a difference, it would have been a failure to understand the differences of these two projects. I mean, the Chronicles of Narnia and the Lord of the Rings trilogy, they're both kind of fantasy allegories, but very, very different, and not just because of the audience, but the way they're written, the aim that they have. I would say even a deeper vision of kind of evangelical Protestantism versus a Catholic vision of what the artist is to do and things, and is expected of doing. So there are differences and it leads to, I think, interestingly enough, preferences that people have for them. I think some people are C.S. Lewis fans more than Tolkien fans in a way, even though they're both great. It's a bit like, I know Father Gregory and I have done one on Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, I think, before. And Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, you tend to be one or the other, although you recognize, like I'm a Dostoevsky fan, but I recognize the brilliance of Tolstoy. And there are passages in Anna Karenina that are just impossible to neglect. And similar, so I'm more of a C.S. Lewis man myself, although I loved The Lord of the Rings. It was read to me, my mother read to me Lord of the Rings when we were growing up. But I'm more of a C.S. Lewis man. But I suspect you're more of a Tolkien man, although you respect C.S. Lewis, but I could be wrong.
That's exactly correct.
Okay.
Yes, you intuited rightly how this conversation was going to go.
Yeah, I figured
because
so.
you know your friend.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's really jump into this here and kind of unpack it. So when we say Tolkien wrote an allegory and C.S. Lewis wrote an allegory, what do we mean?
Yeah, so allegory, of course, is some symbolic representation or a story about something else that's referring to it, has a sign value to it. So their stories are saying one thing and directing us to another. And the interesting point, of course, is how far away that direction is. You could think of it as sometimes a C.S. Lewis criticism of Tolkien would be, you're asking me to turn my chair around to see what I'm supposed to see, whereas Lewis just asks you just to kind of wander your eyes just a little bit. Of course, Tolkien would come back and say, well, why don't you, if you're making it such a slight move in Allegory, why not just say it outright? Like, why give it the cover of anything?
Right.
Like, what's the art of that? You basically took the Christian truth and then just kind of changed a human for an animal, like Aslan for Christ. Whereas instead, you want to see the deeper kind of realities. That's another way, I suppose, is how close to the surface are the deeper realities to be. You could have Lewis be on the more Aristotelian side of things, of a kind of the forms are right here, they're present, we're looking at them. Whereas maybe there's a more Platonistic sense, looking away from the form, from the things, the story of the narrative, to the real eternal truths that are behind that. And that's, again, distance and depth.
So one thing that gave me a deeper appreciation for Lewis, and this is a book which I highly commend to listeners. It was really fantastic work, done by Michael Ward, published by Oxford University Press. So this is a serious book in 2008. It's been around for a bit. And this book has a very particular thesis about the nature of the Chronicles of Narnia, which is very interesting. So an allegory broadly, right, as Father Bonaventure was referring to, is that there's something fantastic, a story, a poem that can be interpreted so as to reveal a hidden meaning, and that something is going to come to light. And often that meaning in an allegory is moral or political. Okay, and in Lewis's sense, people have always said that meaning was the gospel, and this is based on, of course, the Aslan Christ figure in the Chronicles of Narnia. Okay, and I don't think any of that is incorrect. I think this is very true. So Michael Ward's book, Planet Narnia, though, advances a new thesis, which is based on a work of C.S. Lewis on literary criticism called The Discarded Image. And in that work, C.S. Lewis presents a view of the medieval cosmos. And in a nutshell, what Michael Ward argues is that the Chronicles of Narnia, each book is based on a medieval conception of the cosmos, and each book symbolizes that conception's understanding of a particular planet.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was a very long sentence. But the medievals had such a rich understanding of the universe that the planets weren't just like things floating out there in space. They were personalities.
Yeah,
the medieval cosmos is very, very rich, and a whole way of understanding the world was inherent in and lurking behind the understandings of the different planets.
Yeah, that book is really worthwhile for readers to take a look at. It's a very short essay. At the end of that essay, Discarded Image, in this book collection of literary criticism, it has a proto-Kuhnian, and what I mean by that is Thomas Kuhn was a famous philosopher of science in the 20th century, 1962, if I'm not mistaken, is the structure of scientific revolution, where he introduced the idea of paradigm shifts. But the Discarded Image is before that, and the Discarded Image has, at the end of it, talks about the medieval paradigm or the medieval framework that means you understand the world in this particular way. So you bring this grid of intelligibility, the medieval set of these living structures and all of this, the organic model, and then you look at the world through those lenses. And the modern shifts out of that and looks at it with different kind of lenses. Charles Taylor picks this up, of course, in the secular age in those images, in the same way that the disenchantment model. But that's just to say, C.S. Lewis is no joke, and he's right to say that you see things through particular lenses, including this medieval paradigm, which he knew very well. So it's not like his allegory is just some random nice thoughts about things. He's got behind him a very well-developed notion of the world, so that perhaps it's not as fair for Tolkien to say that he hasn't developed it. He just doesn't show you it.
Exactly.
In the way that Tolkien shows his structure much more clearly, and the meaning kind of slides back, whereas C.S. Lewis, you might say, puts the emphasis on the meaning quick, and the structure is in the background that you have to know. And Ward's work has done to bring this sort of structure out.
Exactly. So what kind of meaning is there to be had? Just so listeners can get a really robust sense of this. So the medieval world understood. Let's take The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. You know, the first book of the Chronicles, according to one particular order.
Yes. Yes.
Namely, the order in which it was written.
Yes.
But The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is dedicated, according to Ward's interpretation, to the planet Jupiter. And Jupiter, in the medieval cosmos, is the great planet of joy and of feasting. and that Jupiter's virtues are kingliness and magnanimity, in particular that kind of pleasure that comes in late spring. Okay, so we can all think to the Chronicles of Narnia, and we can find ourselves in the moment where the White Witch's power is waning and spring begins to come, and all this conviviality and joy happens. You see the woodland creatures gathering for their festivity. Father Christmas comes and gives everyone presents. We could get to that. That's the thing that Tolkien really, really hated was the introduction of Father Christmas into this mythical world. And you can see C.S. Lewis saying, okay, I'm writing a story about the planet Jupiter according to the medieval cosmos, which means that every good and beautiful and joyful thing that I can think of is going to be in this story.
Yes.
That's how Father Christmas ends up coming and delivering presents in the Chronicles of Narnia. And so you have here the kingliness, the emphasis on the two kings and the two queens, the kind of royal nature. Yeah, exactly. The reclaiming of the kingdom, the joy, the fading of winter into spring, and all of that points to how the medieval cosmos talked about the virtues and aspects and elements of the planet Jupiter.
Which one's Mars? Is that
you could line this up with all of his books? Well, it's really cool. So Mars is Prince Caspian.
Right.
Mars is Prince Caspian. Okay, why is this one? Well, because Caspian is all about strength and discipline, courage, about order, particularly against cruelty and lawfulness. So this symbolizes the planet Mars. I also really like the interpretation of the magician's nephew, which is lined up in the medieval cosmos with Venus.
Yeah, that's a bad book.
With Venus. Oh, you don't like that one? Okay,
well I was
that's
told.
I really
I read that one first.
Well, we could jump to the last battle, which is Saturn.
Okay, yeah, of course.
So that's got an explicit reference to Plato. You should love that.
That's fine. Yeah, that's right.
So Saturn is all about disaster and death, or godly sorrow, or farther time, contemplation, farther time, things to come, future times, in the medieval cosmos, and the circumstances at the beginning of the last battle, which are pestilence, disaster, treachery, all this kind of evil that comes, is resolved in a coming about of the further up and farther in.
Yes.
So this kind of this awakening that is part of how medievals would have understood the planet Saturn.
Yeah, I think it's beautiful to think about the cosmos as telling us things about the world, and we still have an inkling of this, no pun intended, with horoscopes, right? There's still people still think they still read. I don't know if no one reads a newspaper anymore, but you can still find these things that like the moon, planets do something to us. Most of us think the planets are just kind of like rocks or gas clouds, but there's still this semantic, so the meaning sense that they give to the world. And the medievals just were more attentive to this, not because they necessarily thought, for instance, that all these planets were inhabited and did these particular things, but rather they symbolized structures of our reality and conceptions of it. And Lewis was just very good at seeing that. He saw things poetically, such that I think it was less of a slide from him to be doing his fiction, which is also why his nonfiction, this is interesting, if you read Tolkien's kind of nonfiction, I think you get when he's talking, you get there's a strong sense between when he's doing his literature and when he's not doing his literature. Whereas Lewis, it's a degree. It's kind of sliding back and forth. He has this notion of supposalism is a kind of way of understanding what he's doing when he's thinking about what a planet would be like without this. Or even in his writing about pain or very difficult issues, there's always a bit of the fantastical or the imaginary, that he just dwells in this, so he's never quite going on and off. He doesn't have a binary switch between fictional and non-fictional. They're always kind of related to each other. And I've always appreciated that, and maybe that's another reason why he's harder to read in his just pure fiction and his fantasies, because he's always kind of doing fantasy. It's a question of what end of the spectrum he's on in that.
Right. So I wanted to mention Ward's thesis and give a sense of some of this medieval cosmology, which Lewis would have known, because if you don't have that context for arguments, making a defense for the richness of the Chronicles of Narnia, when you read Tolkien's criticism, it could be brutal.
Yeah.
And Tolkien could just sound really nasty. So for example, Tolkien says to their friend Roger Green, it really won't do.
Yeah.
It really won't do. I mean to say, nymphs and their ways, the love life of a fawn. He's making fun of one of the books on the bookcase there of Mr. Tumnus's bookcase. Doesn't he know, Tolkien continues, doesn't he know what he's talking about?
Yes.
Which is just eviscerating.
Of course.
Really difficult.
I mean, Tolkien's life project is developing, he's got an attentiveness to this detail. It's going to work pure. I mean, inventing his own language. Like, for instance, in C.S. Lewis's Out of the Silent Planet, the Hroths, whatever, those kind of swamping creatures, they have their own language, but I'm
sort of like
morally
whale language.
Yeah, I'm morally certain that C.S. Lewis did not develop it in its full grammar. Like, I don't know. Maybe he did,
No,
but I don't think
he did
so.
not. No.
It's not important to him.
No.
Whereas there are people who speak Elvish, right? There are people who write, it's an entire language. I mean, much better than Klingon. It has its full kind of complement. You can do this. You just couldn't do that with any of Lewis. And Tolkien would say, well, if you want to really get this full product, this kind of full vision, you need to get granular. You need to get in there. Whereas, again, Lewis has this conception of you've got to get stuff done. Not in the pragmatic pure sense, but like it's about the message of the gospel, such that you can read the Lord of the Rings and have no idea, I think, that Christ is involved. I think it's possible to totally do that.
Right.
It's harder to do that with the Chronicles of Narnia. You can do it. That's why it's an allegory. But I think it's pretty hard to believe that people could get away with that for too long.
To get a little bit more into Father Bonaventure, you mentioned this distinction. You think that Narnia has more of a kind of evangelical conception as opposed to that which lurks behind Tolkien's approach.
Yeah.
Say a little bit more about this distinction.
Well, because I've been piecing together what the distinction is, why I like one or the other, why you like one or the other, and then what the deeper kind of issues might be, because they're both in a sense apologetic in a way. They're both about, Tolkien is about good and evil. It's about Christ to some extent. C.S. Lewis as well. And I'm wondering if, I'm just teasing this idea about in my mind, that it's the difference between evangelical Protestantism and its relationship to the world and art, and Catholicism its relationship to the world and art, in this way, that evangelical Protestantism, which I grew up in and know well, has a sort of, the world is there to be used for this other gospel message. Like, there's a sort of simplicity, a sort of simple piety in the evangelical approach to things, because you're not holding things too tightly because you don't expect to find God in them necessarily.
Right.
Because of the notions of original sin. Now, C.S. Lewis, of course, has doctrines of original sin. It's not as dark as some Calvinist doctrines, but he's still got a sense of, like, it's a fallen world and we need to be called by megaphone of pain and all this stuff. So he's got this, but the Protestant model of a sense of the world is not where we're supposed to be. It's not the greatest place, and any way we can get people to believe in Christ, any way to signal this sort of salvation and signal the gospel, that's the key. Revelation over reason, you could say in one way. Faith over just pure knowledge. And the explicit over the implicit, right? So there's more of a surface kind of attentiveness because the things around are so kind of shattered and broken that none of it's not going to fit perfectly anyway. Like bringing, for instance, Father Christmas in. Oh, it doesn't fit the perfect schema of this thing, but nothing fits the perfect schema of a world made by men. It's only Christ's world that fits the perfect schema, so we don't worry too much. On the other hand, I'm interested to see if you think of this. What do you think about this? Tolkien, with the Catholic vision, I was raised in the Catholic faith, as far as I know, he's Catholic, and a depth of the fact that God permeates and structures all things, such that a focus on the rationality of the world and its attentiveness to God, less a focus on the kind of cognitive effects of original sin, a greater trust in man's capabilities to reason and create, a trust in the artistic sensibilities, as opposed to a distrust in the Protestant world to aesthetic sensibilities sometimes and images and all of this, so that for Tolkien, the faith is, in the Catholic sense, something really grounded in the narrative. It's there. In this case, Tolkien is the Aristotelian, with the truth being in the story, whereas Lewis plays, as normally in the Protestant world, the more Platonist. The truth is out somewhere else,
abstract,
and the story just is supposed to point you, but you're not supposed to focus on it. What do you think about this?
I completely agree with you. I think this is right on the money, especially because Tolkien views himself as a con-creator.
Yes.
When an artist is creating something for Tolkien, you're co-creating.
Yes.
And that you can never get too far from what was. So Middle-earth is a kind of prehistory of England, actually.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't exist apart from something that really is, despite the fact that it's fantasy literature.
Yes.
And all of it is imagined. And one hesitates to use that word because it makes it sound a little too simplistic. But is dreamed by the artist. But for Tolkien, that's not done independently of reality. It's done radically connected to it, actually, in his conception, his understanding, because he's the co-creator, and he's lending the reality greater meaning and shedding a new light upon it in the work.
And you think that Tolkien can respond to Lewis on this as well and say, look, I'm staying closer to God than you are in a way because I'm staying close to what he's created and how I'm supposed to. So I'm getting exactly what I need for these stories. Whereas Lewis, you're just imagining things, and aren't those just your own fantasies? And need we be psychologists and Freudians and wonder if you're just kind of putting stuff, like you're the one who's straying from the gospel more because you're not basing it in sound reality. But again, Lewis, the Protestant side of things is, no, sound reality we don't get to read. We need the words of Scripture, and the closer we stick to that, sola scriptura kind of stuff, that's where we get. So I think in some ways, and I've never seen anyone talk about this, but I'm sure they have. Every good idea anyone has has probably been thought before. But that fundamentally the division is really an aesthetic related to their commitments to Catholicism and evangelical Protestantism, and that helps to alleviate and understand why some of us, for instance, me trained up in the evangelical Protestant tradition, why I'm very sympathetic to Lewis's project, whereas the Catholics tend to be more sympathetic, or you grew up in the Catholic tradition in this kind of rich, robust sense of concrete reality and God making things to point to him in the things, would be more sensitive and open to Tolkien. Whereas I get worried that things get lost in there, and this whereas a Catholic thinks actually that's where things ought to be.
Listeners, I hope this helps you sort through this great question of the different approaches to allegory from Lewis and Tolkien, because, of course, like many episodes on Godsplaining, much more could be said about what we've raised. But whether you come down on the side of C.S. Lewis or the side of Tolkien, you are welcome here to be a Godsplaining listener. So we thank you for tuning in. We ask that you would continue to pray for us. If you enjoyed this episode and want to support the podcast, please make a donation to us on Patreon. Share this episode with a friend, with someone you think would enjoy it, would benefit from listening to it. Be sure to like and subscribe to Godsplaining wherever you listen to your podcasts, and follow us on social media on the social media platform X, Facebook, Instagram, and more. Above all, we ask that you would pray for us, and please know that we are praying for you. God bless.
Father Jacob Bertrand.
Father Gregory.
A Dominican, a Franciscan, and a Jesuit walk into a bar. One of them asks the audience to subscribe. That's not a joke. Any ways you can improve upon it?
Just don't tell jokes.
Right. This is not a joke. Please subscribe. Cheers.